Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Mukund, it's wonderful to be in conversation with you. The Great Flap was one of my favorite reads of 2024. It's a bit of micro-history that very few people know about. Mukund's managed to condense in about 200 pages, less than 200 pages, a very fascinating non-event, as it were. And I think in the subtitle you have the word non-invasion, right? Like the Great Flap of 1942, how a Japanese non-invasion, la la la. Just set the context for us. What exactly was this non-invasion, this non-event that actually caused so many events to take place afterwards?
Yep. So essentially, in the book, I suggest that there were a series of very, very important things that were happening in India which have really not been properly recorded at all. And essentially, this was a result of a fear that the Japanese would invade India, which arguably was not a completely unreal fear, because the Japanese actually came close. They sent, aircraft carriers into the Indian Ocean. They bombed places like Visakhapatnam and Kakinada and parts of the Northeast. But they never had any intention of invading India. But the British took measures, and I argue in the book, that actually stoked a great sense of panic, and people fled from pretty much all over the country. I know people are aware that there was an evacuation in Madras, but I don't think many people know that it's possible that almost 90% of Madras could have fled. Visakhapatnam was evacuated. There was an exodus from places like Delhi and Ahmedabad, Bombay, which at one time over 25% of Bombay had fled. So this is really a story of which has been unmapped and largely unrecorded. And I try to relate that. That's one aspect of the story. The other aspect of the story is that I argue that the events of 1942, this fear, actually shaped the course of the nationalist movement. And we need to examine the major events of 1942, the Cripps mission and Gandhi's call for quit India, in the context of this fear, which I think is not done enough.
What I loved about your book is that it begins with a personal anecdote featuring your mother. And it's quite interesting that when we think, 1942, World War II is going on, people think that, the Japanese are going to attack the whole half of Madras, or 75% of Madras decides to take off. You also bring it alive with little details. For example, there's a bit about how your family tried to stay on until the day the milkman stopped delivering milk. There's also this bit about how when people came back, they found that because it was an abandoned city, thieves had taken off everything, doorknobs, grills, whatever they could find, everything had been stripped bare. Give us that personal story of this Great Flap, your mother's story or your family's story. How did individual families and individuals themselves deal with this situation?
Yeah, so my mother's family fled for a whole year. And they had a house in Brodie's Road, which is now R.K. Mutt Road. And when they came back a year later, you're right, my grandfather apparently put his foot down and said, we're not leaving, where many others' families were leaving. And then the milkmen stopped coming, and then, Exodus has its own dynamic. The more people leave, the more people leave. So I think this is exactly what happened to them. And so when they came back, they found the house completely stripped bare. And this was not uncommon. I mean, thieves had the run of places like Kochi, where there was an exodus as well. So empty streets and the lack of police and this focus on a possible Japanese invasion just allowed thieves to have a free run. So when my mother came back, actually, many lives changed, and her life changed. She was not admitted into the second year of her intermediate, so she had to find a new college to go to, which again, I think shaped her personality in critical ways, because she met people that she may not have met at that time. So I think the flap impacted people in different ways. But I think one of the things that fascinated me about this was, what was this all about? Why did so many people flee so many parts of India? I mean, coastal Orissa, coastal Tamil Nadu. for an invasion that was never even planned. And that's, I think, the story of the flap, this kind of dystopian futility about what took place. And why it never got reported fully is something that sort of astonished me, and I discovered only when I was doing research on the book. I think we talked about this. I mean, the British were in such a panic that they shifted the capital of Orissa, which was Cuttack, to Sambalpur, because they thought Cuttack, which was, between the arms of the Mahanadi River, would be terribly sort of vulnerable if the Japanese attacked. Secretariat in Kochi was shifted to Thrissur, which is something that most Malayalis don't know about. So essentially, part of the story is to sort of relate what really happened, and that's a part of the flap. Yeah.
Can we also get the other mic working, please? Also, the geographical span, you mentioned Kochi and Orissa. Considering that this panic sees so many parts of the country, especially the coastal districts, across, whether it's East Coast, West Coast, doesn't matter. Why is it that we don't remember it? Why do you think that neither the British side made much in terms of leaving an account of all of this, or even the nationalist side? Somehow these stories exist in families and silences and memories like that. But until your book came around, nobody really had sat down and thought that this was a story worth telling. Why, that silence, was it conscious, or was it simply because nobody who was likely to tell the story felt they had anything to gain by telling that story?
Yeah, good question. I wondered about this myself. I think one of the reasons is that traditionally historians have focused on the freedom movement. Even British historians, but they only called it the transfer of power, where we called it a struggle for freedom. So this story actually slipped between the cracks because no one was paying attention to this. And finally, it was a non-event. The Japanese didn't invade. So I think that played a role as well. So I think these are some of the reasons that it slipped through the cracks. The other thing is that you'd imagine that if 75 to 90%, 75% definitely, possibly much more, if 75 to 90% of Madras evacuated, you would imagine that the newspapers of the time, including the one I edited, would have photographs of empty streets or long reports of what was happening. There's very little of that because the newspapers themselves, and I'm not particularly critiquing the Hindu or any other paper, because the newspapers of the time themselves were essentially focused on politics and statements and so on. There was very little human interest. If you mind the newspapers of that time, there was very, very little human interest stories at that time. So that's true of the Express. The Express has very little. So much of what I ferreted out of the newspapers were single column stories about, additional trains to evacuate people and, some statements saying, okay, don't panic, and so on and so forth. So I think it was neglected by the press, and I think this compounded the neglect. And also, I think the flap, people have looked at the fortnightly reports, which is a major source for historians. But the story of the flap that I got, much of it emerged from Lindletow's own communication with the governors, which is, I think, something that maybe people didn't look at that closely. And also the private diaries of bureaucrats at the time, which the British Library has preserved. So that was very crucial to this emerging.
I'm curious, did it have no reflection at all in cinema or novels? None of that either?
Well, there is, there was Shivaji Ganeshan's film which touches on that time, but nothing really major. There's stray references here and there. In M.S.S. Pandian's biography on MGR, there's a line saying that, which cites another biography of MGR, which is like a hagiography, I think, suggests that he was brave because he did not flee at that time. But beyond that, there is very, very little in the papers. And I think, I'm sitting here with people who are from Chennai, and I'm sure at least quite a few of them have parents or grandparents who fled. And the thing is, we're not very good at keeping records of what really happened. So there are a couple of writers that I quote. I mean, Pudumai Pittan sent his wife away, and there's some record of that. But there's very, very little. I think people have just, it's there in their minds. It's not on paper. And I haven't, lots of people had stories. I didn't put too much of that into the flap because they didn't have dates and so on. So I wanted to write something which was a little more, grounded in evidence.
It's funny you mentioned that anecdote with MGR and how they say that he was brave enough not to flee, because you also have a segment in the book where you talk about the British and how on the one hand they were encouraging all non-essentials to leave.
Yeah.
Essentially, anybody who's not part of the government, who isn't absolutely necessary on the spot, has to leave.
Yeah.
They're encouraging people to leave. But they're also using this to say that, oh, Indians are chicken, Indians are not brave, they're not good at resisting this way.
Absolutely. I mean, Lindithgo's communications and the communications of the governor of Bombay and Calcutta are just so cynical and cold. I mean, they treat this entire issue like a managerial issue. They're not bothered about loss of livelihood, people fleeing. All classes fled, not just the wealthy. They just see this as like, if we have less people here and the Japanese attack, we'll be able to the army will be able to deal with the city much better. So they were in favor of people leaving the so-called threatened areas. And this shines through the records, that the flap was really of British making in many ways. And that surprised me. That's something I didn't know about the story when I started researching it. And then again, they kept saying Indians are fleeing because they're Indians and they're timid. And then I discovered the story that in Kodaikanal, Americans and British people, American missionaries, the Korea school was founded by American missionaries, they fled because a rumor had taken root. And this was a time of great rumors. There were absurd rumors about, there's a rumor about, I'll give you one or two. There's a rumor about a Japanese man who's supposed to have landed in a parachute in a place, address a crowd, and then gone back up in his parachute to the sky. And the people believed all these kinds of things. So just a rumor gripped Kodaikanal, and people flew Kodaikanal, fled Kodaikanal in buses and cars and so on. So, the extraordinary stuff happened during that time, which has not been, which has just got lost, these stories. Yeah.
It reminds me, as I was reading the book, I kept thinking about the only reference that I have from my own time, our own time, which is COVID. Right, when COVID happened and people went back to their native towns, workers had to leave. And I remember those initial days when everybody had vanished, right? So you had to go out and buy supplies and the streets would be empty. And you've got that kind of evocative sentences in the book, and you could almost visualize and compare it with the COVID period. And as you were talking about bureaucrats looking at it as a managerial problem, I think we saw some of that in more recent times in the COVID crisis as well. But how does one evacuate a city? You have this wonderful, wonderful anecdote about bureaucrats and I think a minister arguing over the zoos in Madras and whether all the dangerous animals should be shot now or whether they should wait for an actual invasion to shoot the dangerous lions and tigers and all those animals.
Yeah, so what happens in Madras is special in a way, or very idiosyncratic. What happens in Madras is around the 9th or 10th of April, there is false military intelligence that comes in saying a huge Japanese fleet is sailing and they're going to make landfall south of Madras. So the governor Arthur Hope, then actually flies to Bangalore with a senior army person, gets it confirmed in Bangalore that actually this is happening, this intelligence is true, comes back to Madras and says the entire government is to scatter. So the Hope's government just scatters. The High Court goes to Coimbatore and Anantapur, one section. The departments that move to Bangalore, the Accountant General moves to Bangalore. They all scatter inland. Salem, Madurai, different departments go to different places. And for nothing, because this is just false information. And so in Madras, at that time, they're convinced that the Japanese are coming. And so they order that all the dangerous animals, which basically are animals that could prey on humans if Japanese bombs fall on Madras Zoo, which then was located close to Central Station, not where it is now, which was in Mandalore, far away. that animals could escape the enclosures and then start, hurting people. So better to kill them all. And preceding this, the Corporation Commissioner, a very powerful man, a powerful post at that time, a man called Reddy, he's trying to get these dangerous animals moved to Mysore and Hyderabad and Erode and various other places. So he keeps writing saying, can you take these animals? Because Madras is perceived as a threatened area. None of them respond. So finally, they just walk in on April 14th, and in a matter of few minutes, the Marbar Special Police is called in, and they just shoot all the animals dead.
So you needed the Malayalis to come in and shoot all the zoo animals in Tamil Nadu.
You did a great job.
You have a line in the book which I found very interesting, where you say Pearl Harbor was the insurance, Southeast Asia was the price for the Japanese. And I say it's interesting because often when we think of that period, there's a Eurocentric reading of that period where it's Pearl Harbor, the Americans entering the war, all of that. But through this book, you've actually highlighted what's happening in Asia with the Japanese and really the spread of Japanese conquests, through all the way to Singapore, inching closer and closer to India. And it really alters in some ways the way we look at the war itself.
So I was speaking about the book in an American university a few months ago at Emory, and I used this very example to start the talk because the Americans believe that the Japanese, they just believe that the Japanese intent was to somehow defeat American power, go in there, and Pearl Harbor was just the beginning of a lot was that to come. But Pearl Harbor was very, very limited from the perspective of Japanese strategic intent. All they wanted to do was to take out the Navy, so that they had access to the iron ore and the tin and the oil and everything else in Southeast Asia. The U.S. had an embargo on them, so the steel and oil, the two main commodities for war, was a problem for them. So Pearl Harbor was just very, very limited. They were looking at Southeast Asia. So Pearl Harbor was just insurance in a way, and Southeast Asia was the prize. And the Americans just don't get that. They believe that they were the big target. So that's absolutely true.
But was that something so the sort of correcting that Eurocentric view, was that something you already had a sense of, or as you did the research?
I'm not sure whether, this is only my view. I think anyone who studies that period, any military historian will probably agree that the Japanese objective was limited and they wanted to take it out. But of course, Pearl Harbor is what we learn about in films and so on and so forth. So that becomes the big story. But from the Japanese perspective, Southeast Asia was a big story. And from India's perspective, because the panic in India, the very day they attacked Pearl Harbor, they launched synchronous operations in Southeast Asia. And one of them is a land operation. They bomb Singapore, they bomb Hong Kong. But they have a invasion in Kota Baru in Malaysia. And the first people who face the Japanese, ironically, are Indians who are sort of stationed there. And the moment they attack Malaya, the panic sets in India. And within a week of that attack, which is December 7th, 1941, between a period of the 13th and 30th of December, 17 days, 17% of Calcutta's population flees. This is official. 17% just runs away, and then more and more after that. So
now, another thing, another larger sort of point you make in the book is also about the Raj itself. On the one hand, they're facing an anti-colonial movement in the country. There's this impression of control that they want to maintain. But every bit of bad news that's coming in about the Japanese conquering this place, that place, going into Singapore, all of that, it's affecting the morale of the officials as well. There's a lot of flip-flopping, confusion about how to deal with that. The other thing also is the Indian nationalists. And you have this very tantalizing argument or suggestion you make in the book that important events that took place in 1942, Quit India, the Cripps mission and so on the nationalist side, how far did this potential threat of the Japanese destabilizing British power empower the nationalists to sort of negotiate in a tougher way, etc.?
Yeah, so the book tries to map how the major figures in the Congress, I think the Cripps was largely aimed at, winning the Congress over, saying support our war effort and we'll give you a little more, towards, or set you on some path towards greater self-governance. Nehru and Rajagopalachari were on the side, like a lot of Congress people were on it. Gandhi, however, thought that any support to the war would compromise his position on pacifism. So he actually, refuses to meet Cripps when Cripps comes here. And then Cripps, virtually has to make a pitch, and then he writes this letter saying, oh, so you really want to meet me, but, I've nominated Nehru and Azad. Okay, but I'll see you, but, what do I have to, do about it? So there's this, you can see Cripps, or the failure of the Cripps mission, as in terms of just a negotiation. He offered that, we wanted this, he offered that, and it broke down. But Gandhi, it is true, was opposed to Cripps all the time. And I think there are British historians who believe that he virtually scuppered Cripps, that Nehru was quite okay with doing a deal. Also, it's important to see that when Cripps was in India, Nagumo, who is the hero of Pearl Harbor, Vice Admiral, sails with this huge fleet of 5 or 6 aircraft carriers, a bunch of destroyers and cruisers into the Indian Ocean and bombs Colombo and Trincomalee, and then they take out a couple of, aircraft carrier and a big destroyer that the British have. All this is happening when Cripps is talking to the Congress. And all this is happening also at a time when people like Nehru, on record, and others, Azad, for instance, though sometimes people question Azad's motives and so on, that they believed that Gandhi thought that Japan would win the war. Because remember, between December 7th and the Battle of, Coral Sea and Midway, the Japanese just won everything. There is not a single battle the British won. They just, anything, they were on the retreat. I mean, they pushed out of Malaya, pushed out of Singapore, all over. So we're looking at a time when it is very, very possible, and this is what the British feared, that people were walking into, people were getting influenced by Japanese propaganda. People were listening to Berlin radio and listening to Singapore broadcasts coming from the Axis. Bose was then, of course, also broadcasting from Germany. So it was a period when the British felt they were losing the propaganda war.
And the nationalists thought they could use this Japanese threat.
Yeah, the Congress thought that it made politics, that, okay, the British are on the back foot, they have a war fighting.
Why should we
support the war, but you give us more freedom. I mean, this was basically it, which Gandhi had a problem with.
And what was Gandhi's view on the Japanese, if I may ask?
So that's interesting. So there are people at that time, including the biographer of Nehru, Gopal, a Madras person and one of India's great historians and biographers, who actually says that Gandhi adopted what he calls a pro-Japanese position, which he then reverted, which he then stepped back from later on. And Gandhi actually wrote more than one piece saying why I'm not pro-Japanese. He felt compelled to explain to people why he was not pro-Japanese. But I think there is some evidence to suggest that he did believe the Japanese would win the war. As far as his position, it was, Gandhi's position, as Nehru suggests in Discovery in India, was not, I'm paraphrasing Nehru now, he didn't say it in so many words, but it was not, he didn't have a ideological worldview the way that Nehru did. For him, and he's argued that before, an exploiter is an exploiter. How does it make a difference whether he's Japanese or whether he's British? So this was there was a sort of a moral equivalence that he had, I think, that he had at that time. Not that he loved the Japanese, but he thought, he actually argued, he told American journalists this, what difference is this going to make? Who comes and rules over us? Nehru, however, had, a sort of ideological view on this. very, very firmly for the Axis powers. So I think there was that divide. And Gandhi finally comes around. After saying that I will not have, get into the war, he finally he does, actually it's a flip-flop. He finally gives in around just, July or August, or just, I don't remember exactly when. He says, okay, it's fine. You can have international troops on Indian soil. I will not oppose it. And then he has an explanation. He says, I've been saying all of this, I say this, and then he has an explanation of why he's changed his position, which is not entirely convincing, but he does change position.
Typical
and then
Gandhi, no?
From China, Chiang Kai-shek's wife writes to Nehru saying, it must have taken a lot for you to, turn Gandhi around. Yeah.
In all of Gandhi's writings, does he ever comment on what's happening with the people fleeing, moving lock, stock and barrel back to their villages?
Yeah, exactly. Gandhi actually says, yeah, okay, go. And other people say also, yeah, what's the problem? Leave, because if you don't give us arms to defend ourselves, what's the harm in fleeing if you're at risk? Rajagopalachari says stay and then fight and resist the Japanese. So he takes a completely different line on this. So there again, I think the war divides the Congress. And Gandhi is, well, I don't know if sidelined is the right word, but definitely he takes positions which are ignored. Resolutions are passed that he doesn't like during that time. But mid-1992, quit India, and this is the other great mystery. Why does a man who all along, 39 the war breaks out, he says, I will not embarrass the British. I will do nothing to embarrass the British at this juncture when they're fighting a war. Why does he in 42, to Nehru's astonishment and discomfiture, actually say, okay, it's time you up and went. So a man who was seen on the very, if right and left are actually expressions, the right of the Congress party has suddenly gone more left than Nehru and says up and go. And Nehru is actually worried at that time. But, Gandhi finally unifies the party and Congress, by Quit India.
You raised this question in the book, but I'm curious, did any Gandhi scholars write to you and sort of explain any of this?
I'm curious about this. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, they're experts in this field. I mean, Gandhi does some odd things during the war. One of the things he does is, I'm not talking about his letters to Hitler. He writes 2 letters to Hitler, saying, my dear friend, and these are appeals essentially to win the war. But he also, in 2 communications, one with Viceroy Linlithgow and another to Amrit Kaur, who becomes India's health minister, and he has this very jokey, playful kind of relationship with. He actually, and this is at the time when Hitler is invading France and the Low Countries, he actually says, Hitler is not such a bad man, and as people make him out to be. And he's won his victories without bloodshed and so on. There are few lines. And I would think lines like that merit some kind of explanation from some biographer, some expert in the field. But the letters are there. Anyone who can open the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi can see them. But I've maybe found them because I was looking for war-related stuff. But even so, I think Gandhi's shifts during 1942 and the positions that he takes, I think, certainly merit greater inquiry.
We've only got 7 minutes more, so I'll open up for audience questions. But the book has a lot more in terms of these interesting details and anecdotes. I loved that one segment. I forget the name of one of these governors of Madras and this huge corruption scandal he was caught up in the same period and all of that. It just feels like this thing feels like a humming that seems to build up and then ultimately leads to nothing. It sort of fizzles out. It's really like the setting of a dystopian novel rather than something you expect in a history book. Yeah. And that's the tone of your...
They built a dummy fort on Marina Beach thinking it'll scare off Japanese planes. They cut coconut trees, painted them black, and laid them out on the beach because they thought they'd look like anti-aircraft guns. So there
was also something you write about somebody in Delhi inventing something where you burn tar or something and then smoke up the air so that the planes can't see.
The poet W.H. Auden's brother actually invents this invents this substance which he says will produce smoke and cloud our buildings at a time when no Japanese plane could have reached Delhi. So,
An alternative title to the book could be How Not to Panic in Strange Times. On that note, we've got, I think, 6 minutes, so we'll open up to audience questions. You can raise your hands and somewhere a mic will go. I see Janaki Lenin's hand is up promptly. Salil Tripathi also.
Hi, this is a question to both of you. I'm fascinated by your book, of course, which looks at a completely unknown bit of history, and Manu, of course, is doing his own sort of superstar numbers. Do you believe that there is a certain revival in history writing in India today? Do you see that, and if so, what is causing it?
I think he's better placed to answer that. I mean, yeah, he's like leading that pack.
You too.
No, I think there is, of course, a general interest in history, which has always been there. But I think as time passes, we also move out of these large issues about nationalism, freedom struggle, all of those big events, and start looking at these smaller stories. And there's so much to really chew on in the smaller stories, right? You find interesting characters, you find interesting dynamics, corrupt British officials in the 1940s. You connect that to an 18th century incident where also governors in Madras were extremely corrupt and easily earning a fortune while pretending to be civilizing Indians. You know, so you start making and connecting dots which earlier people might have missed in some way. I think it's also just a novelty. We don't sometimes realize the level of stories, the layers that we have, the kind of material we have in this country. Mukund's really taken a non-event and written a 200-page book on it. So the actual events also that took place, just imagine the kind of stories we could tell. And since more and more people are now investigating these less told, chapters in our history, or highlighting individuals who were obscured in earlier times, but deserve a better kind of appraisal, I think that leads to a renewed interest in history. You can always tell because there's heaps of young people who are buying these books, it's heaps of young people who are attending these events, and that itself is a sign that people are interested. Yeah, in a different way, I would say.
Hi, Mukund and Manu. Two questions for you, Manu. Mukund, sorry. It's one thing to write a book that leads up to a climax, a dramatic climax, and then go down for an ending. It's another thing to write a book about something that it's a non-invasion, like it doesn't happen. So how did you as a writer deal with that? Were you always wondering, how do I give the readers the satisfaction of a climax that doesn't happen? And the second question is, did you look for papers in a Japanese archive, and what was their actual plan? Where if Southeast Asia was the real target, what were they planning? I mean, that I didn't get a sense of what that was.
I'll deal with the second question first. So, it's not that the Japanese had no strategic intent in India. They did. When they took Malaya and when they took Singapore, the INA, Subhash Bose came much, much later. The INA was founded by men like Mohan Singh, Pritam Singh at that time. And they trained them. And they had this idea of this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And, there are various versions of which country was included and which country was not. But at one time, India was talked of as belonging to that sphere. And they definitely wanted to rid, the British from India, or rid India of the British, sorry. And so that was a part of the game plan. But while they conducted bombings, sporadic bombings, and even these bombings have not been properly recorded. When I went to the archives in London, I found that they flew many more sorties and bombed many more places in Northeast Asia than people remember. But they never had any plan of launching a full-fledged ground invasion, not in 1942. And they didn't have one in 1944 either, but we'll talk about that later if someone asks a question. They had no such plan at all to do that. So this is essentially known now that they had no plan. They didn't have the wherewithal. They came close. They threatened. They had propaganda. They were constantly trying to get Indians to work against the British. And they did a damn good job at one time. I mean, you know, of Gandhi has this letter in the collected works where he actually says that there's a large constituency of people who think that, you know, the Japanese would be okay if they came in. And that was the mood at that time. So, you know, Bose was not actually operating in an entire vacuum, I think, when I think back. As far as the second question, yeah, it's a non-event, but, you know, the invasion was a non-event, but lots of stuff was happening. And I think the reason why it got ignored is because it was, you know, the invasion never happened. It was a non-event. But I think what preceded it, all those crazy stuff that preceded it, I think actually had an impact on, you know, like I say, on the events that sort of finally led to freedom or independence. I mean, it shaped the way people think. It shaped the way Rajagopalachari thought, certainly. It shaped the way Gandhi thought, the positions Nehru took. So, you know, it might have been a non-event, but it was an event. The threat was on everybody's minds and influenced them.
We have a gentleman there with the mic. Can I just add, though, Janki, to your question? Although there isn't one conclusive climax to the book, almost in every chapter you sit up thinking, really, they did this? You know, how bizarre, why did they behave this way? In some ways, each chapter gives you a lesson in how human beings, organizations, government behave when they're under paranoia, when they're sort of seized by paranoia, the almost irrational things they end up doing. That itself is fascinating.
So they gave the appearance that it might be an event. Yeah? I don't know how many of you know this, but around the time Nagumo attacks Sri Lanka or Ceylon, they send an aircraft carrier and a clutch of cruisers and destroyers to the Bay of Bengal. And this is under a man called Ozawa, also in Pearl Harbor. And they're actually taking out merchant vessels, international merchant vessels, at will over 2 days. At least 20 merchant vessels are sunk off the coast, most of it off the coast of Orissa. And that happens over 2 days. And this is, again, another thing that has vanished from our memories. Most people don't even remember this. So the Japanese came close to, I mean, they did scare us, but that was their intention, only to scare and only to foment, you know, disaffection, never to invade. Yeah,
yes, sir.
Sorry.
Thank you. Mukul, you say that Gandhi's Quit India battle, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. So it unified the Congress. But at the same time, there was a lot of contestation within the Congress. But thinking about it retrospectively, these two things, suppose there was no Quit India movement and a kind of openness to strips commission, the destiny would have been different, My second quick query is in terms of Gandhi and Japan via Buddhism. Now, there's a very interesting discussion on Gandhi introducing a Buddhist prayer in his Sarvadharma prayer. And finally, you coming from a philosophical background, in this historical work, what is the kind of dynamics of history and philosophy at work, if any, in a broader historiographical approach to this issue?
Okay, I think that was many questions rolled into one. I don't know where to start. Well, I mean, if ethics is a part of philosophy, I think Gandhi's position on the war certainly reflected a certain moral philosophy. I mean, if you remember, Gandhi actually, to the horror of other congressmen, or to their dismay, actually said, you know, he said things like, you know, he told Lindutko, if Hitler invades Britain, just give up your homes and your lives. And he told the Jews this as well, that they should just give up their lives. The Abyssinians should give up their lives to Mussolini. So, and if someone invades us, we should have only passive resistance. We should not actually violently oppose them. And so this was, again, I think this is a moral philosophical position. You may or may not agree with it. And the idea that any aggressor is bad as any other aggressor, which was, again, a kind of moral equivalency saw between, you know, Japan and this thing. Again, I think stems from a certain ethical position that he took, that essentially a man who commits violence and a man who responds with violence, there's no distinction between the two. And there's enough in his writing that suggests that. So if that is an ethical position that he takes, I guess it's a philosophical position in a way. So the other question was about, what was it, the first question? I forgot.
The philosophical.
No, that I got into the other one.
On the Quit India movement.
Yeah, so the Quit India movement, Gandhi, the Quit India movement materializes in August, right? But by May and June, Gandhi's statements are taking a more firmer tone. Nehru actually records this, saying, Gandhi is the tone of what he's saying is changing from time to time. So Quit India doesn't suddenly happen in August. He's working up to Quit India. And one of the great mysteries, and I leave this to you as a question because I don't know the answer. I tried to read and read and read around it. Why does Gandhi change in 1942? And if you look at answers, why does he change his position? Why does the man who is restraining Bose, restraining Nehru, saying, I will not have mass satyagraha, I'll only do individual satyagraha, which is what he did during the war. Why is this man suddenly, do this radical shift? And I tried reading around. There is one hint in Nehru, and I'll end with this, I think our time's up, where he suggests that Gandhi is getting old. There are sort of intimations of his own mortality. And so maybe he's pushed to doing this. I think Ramchandra Guha in his biography also suggests a sort of similar thing. But we don't really know. I read a lot of histories that, virtually say Gandhi took a radically different step, but doesn't explain actually why. And I think that still remains, it's not clear from his own writings why he does this. And it's not clear from at least the histories I've read why he does this. But this incredible shift that he takes, I think, has done a lot to fashion the freedom movement of the past. And while I don't think Quit India achieved much, frankly, everyone was locked up, and I think we went back to another 3 or 4 years. But I think the hardening of his position certainly set the tone for what happened later.
We're allowed one more question.
Okay.
So my question actually is regarding the challenges of writing history when a lot of archival sources are either getting destroyed or they're becoming inaccessible. British Library, for instance, was hacked, the digital thing, and a lot of the records, I have done research there, and they have amazing material, but when this kind of stuff happens, and when the Delhi city was being, refurbished or whatever, that construction thing, National Archives became inaccessible. So what are the challenges of writing history when these kind of, sources are being denied or they become difficult to reach? Since you wrote, what were the challenges you faced?
Well, one challenge with the Madras archives. So I tried to look at the geos of the time, and nothing was available. They'd all been moved. So there's very little wartime stuff in the Madras archives. So what I did was I found some from the corporation archives, which were relevant. The shooting of the animals and the debates at that time. There were debates, actually quite incredible debates in the Madras Corporation. There were fairly wise and articulate people in the corporation at that time. And I went to Calcutta. I looked at the local sources there as well. And then, of course, the National Archives, the British Library, and so on. My challenge was not so much the archival, digging out the archival, it was COVID. COVID interfered in the book. So it was only after I could visit Britain that I could sit down to actually write the book. I'd written bits of it before that, but the actual writing came after that.
Thank you, everyone, for the questions. Thank you, Mukund.
Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah.